Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with creativity. We celebrate storytelling, and I'm always on the hunt for amazing and interesting people to talk to. I'm Sean Murphy. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University. I run 1455 Lit Arts. You can find out more about me and my writing at seanmurphy.net. Today's guest is Matthew Shipp. The best way I can introduce this is very much a very full circle moment for me, because I was a fan of his work when people used to buy CDs, and I bought a lot of them before I met him. And since I've gotten to know him, my appreciation for him has only gone deeper. And you'll see throughout the course of this conversation why I feel that way, and I hope you agree. Let me introduce him properly with an abbreviated bio from a very distinguished career. Matthew is an American avant-garde jazz pianist, composer, and bandleader. He moved to New York City in 1984 and has been very active since the early 90s, appearing on, it says dozens, way more than dozens, but dozens of albums as a leader, sideman, producer. Critically adored in jazz circles, his work has also been praised by eclectic musicians ranging from David Bowie to Thurston Moore to Henry Rollins. Matthew has recorded with seemingly every meaningful contemporary jazz musician, and his partnerships with William Parker and David S. Ware in particular have received global acclaim. His brand new book, which we're here to discuss, is Black Mystery School Pianists and Other Writings, which I was honored to receive an advanced copy of. Matt, thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you.
Thank you very much. And I love the Sunrise t-shirt.
Oh, right on. And I have to say, I'm always happy to pander. I just put this on, but as I got on camera, I'm like, hey, Matt's gonna like this. So larger forces are at work, which we'll get into that too.
Right.
Of course, I've got a bunch of questions, but I want the through line to be celebrating and talking about your book, which is a considerable achievement. And I'd be selling it short if I described it as Matt Shipp talks about music and his life in music, because this really is an exercise from current and previous writings that kind of show the man in full, your sensibility, what you care about, things that make you tick, and your advocacy for jazz titans from the past, both widely recognized and some obscure names. I think what I took away from this book is, of course, we all know artists don't need to be interesting to make interesting work, but it never hurts. You are a very interesting, deep dude, and that's so reflected in this writing. First off, I just love to ask, you usually attack your art through the piano. How different and rewarding, challenging is it to pick up pen and paper and try to do it through writing?
Um, I I consider myself the instrument. So whatever, if it's a different medium than what I mean, obviously my virtuosity, if you want to call it that, comes from what you focus on, which is playing the piano, because I've been doing that my whole life. I consider myself an all right writer about the things I'm interested in. I cannot write outside of that. But if I'm extremely interested in something and have put a lot of thought behind it for a long time, or know the personality involved with it and can relate it to my own kind of field of energy,
Yep.
then I think I have something to say about it. But it has to be like I could not be a journalist and had to go in and learn the intricacies of something and then turn a piece in a couple of days about it. It just doesn't work. The things I wrote about in this book are things I've been thinking about for 30, 40, 50 years. And I do think I have a pretty intense understanding of subconscious processes. and motivation, and how that kind of how situations and things come about because of that. So, but to answer your question, playing the piano is what I do. Writing is some of those pieces were commissioned,
Yep.
and again, they were about things that I thought very deeply about for long periods of time. So the gestation period for the ideas to come together
Yep.
were not rushed or hurried, or they just naturally came out because I'm always thinking about those things. But the piano is my what I how I usually communicate my ideas.
Right.
I
Right.
don't even know if ideas is the right word, how I communicate my vibration.
Yep. Yep. Well, one of the many things that I love, being a jazz fan, that doesn't play an instrument, has listened to music, since I was, little, I've been obsessed with it. I know a lot about many of the musicians you write about here, but one of the added joys, I would say, even or especially for writers, is you're talking about things from a deep well of personal knowledge and connection, both through music history and your instrument of choice. Um, it's endlessly fascinating for me to hear how someone at your ability kind of assesses geniuses from our past, ranging from Monk to Sun Ra, and contextualizing your own place in this continuum, not from a place of ego, but trying to locate this similar impulse that has made jazz musicians in general go down certain paths, but the Black Mystery School pianists. And feel free to talk a little bit about this concept, which I remember you put a long post up on social media several years ago. And I think there was this universal approbation where people were like, this is going to be something larger, right? And when I found out you were, in fact, going to publish that, made me very happy. But so bunch of different questions in there, but basically talking about how you're contextualizing yourself and also how you wrote that amazing essay.
Right. Well, I mean, you said without ego, I have a big ego. Let's start. So, um, but no, I mean, it's very being a jazz musician. There's so much weight put on past because if you're, I mean, not that there isn't in other things, but like if you're a rock musician, you're basically the emphasis is on youth and on new bands, and even though obviously in the rock pantheon, certain bands and people are held up to extreme high esteem. The focus is not on that, and within jazz, you always feel that people that lived in another generation are authentic, and locating authenticity now seems to be impossible, and you're always like looking in the past, like the way they phrased, the way they did that when you listen to records seems right, but like how within the jazz idiom, living in 2025 or whatever year this is, like how do you get the mindset to consider your own phrase authentic? Because authentic is what black people in jazz did in 1940. That mindset is so prevalent. So trying to, and especially in a very academic sized culture and setting now, if you're trying to be a prophet who's just out here where language is, you're just like you're in a prophet in the desert where vibrational language hits you and you're speaking for divine forces. That impulse is not really celebrated in the world. Let's just leave it at that. I mean, it probably never has been, but it really isn't now. So I think for me, the challenge was to get back to your idols, but not so much the exact language, but the impulse that motivated them, the impulse that made them have trust in whatever phrase they were articulating on their instrument. And if they didn't have self consciousness and is this authentic? Did somebody, if you're in 1940, are you thinking, did somebody in 1920, you know, I mean, so just trying to understand what it is to be alive. That, yeah, I mean, that's because that's basically what you're alive. So if you're alive,
Yeah.
there's some type of life force going through you, and your sense of authenticity can't be like searching old records. Um, Now, we all are products of history and products of language. And in the book, I use the word language in a lot of ways, in a metaphysical way, in an actual linguistic way. I mean, everything is a language. You know, you walk outside, look up at the sun, light is a language. Your nervous system is a language. And obviously, your nervous system generates some type of linguistic structures that we all partake in and use to communicate. Um, Music is a language. But if you're living in 1925 and you define yourself as a jazz musician just
Right.
by the fact that you're alive, I mean, authenticity is in the now. So, I mean, when you're in an idiom that looks to the past so much, how do you come to terms with all that? And the people that I chose to highlight in the book, I feel that their message is you're alive, do something, you know, do something with the life force that's going through your body or that's going through your mind. It, you know, whether you look at the mind as having something to do with the brain or a force field outside the brain that the brain is just a receptor of, whatever is, you're alive. And you know, you can't be caught in academic and cultural traps of what is authentic. You are authentic because you're alive. So do something with it. Figure it out. Figure out where, with the flow of language that goes through history, figure out where you come into the flow. And you have to have a lot of self confidence, trust in the flow to not be self conscious of if something, the feeling that if what I'm saying is authentic, I have the right to say it. It has makes sense, you know. And I don't think you know, if you're going to get to the ego, I don't think it matters at that point. Like, you know, maybe Charlie Parker is a better musician than everybody. But if what you're saying is authentic,
Yeah.
then that's all that's asked of you is to make your statement and
Yeah.
to have trust. And I think with the trust in, if you can get to that point where you trust the statement,
Yeah.
that says everything. Because I think, like, if you look at Thelonious Monk, the great jazz pianist, who was an extremely original. If you actually break down the components of his language, they're not that um, radical. You know, I mean, the way they're put together is, but yeah. So what makes it work? Well, he really trusts his language.
Yes.
That's what I mean. There's and that can't be taught. For an artist to get to a point where they really, really intrinsically trust their place in the flow of history and the language,
Yeah.
that's something that I don't, you know, that's a mystery how somebody gets there. So that's some of the things I'm grappling with in the book.
Yeah, and that brings up so many different thoughts. But I love circling around authenticity because I think that applies to all art forms, obviously, in all eras. I do think jazz musicians in particular in America have traditionally, especially if we look back, connecting lines between, say, Thelonious Monk and yourself. There's an iconoclastic nature of the entire sensibility. And what I think is so enriching, and I think one of the reasons this music endures, um, is that these musicians are somewhat out of time in ways you're describing. They're not super concerned about what the academy or what the current trends. They were obsessed with finding their own voice. They're tapping into something very deep and profound. So it's reflecting the times they lived in, but it
Right,
also can be taken out of that. And it's so divorced from trend and fashion and
right,
cynical
right,
calculation.
right. Well, that's what's interesting because I mean, everybody is a product of their time. You can't escape that.
Right.
And even getting past trend and fashion, I mean, you're still a product of what's going the world that you're in. But at the same time, there's a universality that you can search for that goes past that, which is a product of giving yourself over. to the cosmos in a sense and letting the language flow, whatever that language is. So I mean, on its level, on one level, that's utter simplicity, but on another level, it's the hardest thing to do.
I like, and I'm so glad you said that, Matt, because I want you to push a little. I'm going to push you a little bit because you're such a, for me, a perfect example of so many of the things I talk about when I talk about storytelling and the artistic impulse, which is it's this amazing synergy of practice and dedication. I think an almost obsessive quest for an original voice, which we would call style. A style develops; it doesn't just fall out of the air.
Right.
Um, but also this ability to surrender and let go. And I think any of those things in isolation can be chaotic or nonsensical. But when there's this deep passion and discipline, but also this ability to let things flow, be receptive to channels that are coming out. Clearly, this is what improvisation literally does. But if you want to speak a little bit more about what I would call, for lack of a deeper expression, this balance of different impulses that become artistic expression.
Right. Well, balance is the optimum word here. I mean, and I, I'm not, you can't break creativity down into a formula
Right.
of any sort, but there is a balance. I mean, Sonny, the great tenor sax player, Sonny Rollins, I recall him saying that when he got his horn before he started learning music, he used to just go in his room and just play. And I don't think, he didn't know what he was doing. And, then he studied music and, obviously he knows what he's doing. But there's a part of him that when he plays, he's still doing that thing that he did when he was a kid and got the horn. So, and it's the balance of all that, I mean, I think you have to keep some channel opening to, because I personally believe that great artists are, no matter how much they study, how much supposed technique they get of
Mhm.
any type, what they're communicating is something that they knew at like 2 or 3 years old.
Yeah.
And so, how do you keep that alive? Because society tries to kill that out of you,
Right.
educate it out of you. So, how do you keep that alive, but yet, get the necessary tools you need to be able to communicate in your medium? And that's a really hard balance to find. And I don't know if there's any way of communicating what that balance is, except for praxis of just keep doing stuff. And also, I mean, it's just a weird trust that you had to have in your own internal process and your own intuition.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous. I mean, because there is a chance that you're deluding yourself. Also, that chance is always there. And maybe if you're delusional and you keep pushing within the delusion, maybe that'll end up in a good place. Also, I mean,
Right.
who knows? I mean, it's not working out for our president.
Right. Yeah.
He's delusional, and it's not going to end in a good place for him. But
Yeah.
and I say Ari, not mine. But
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's because that's somebody who has impulses, and for whatever reason he believes his impulses, and they're not correct.
Right.
But who so um there's a real fine balance in all this, and it's hard to really to say how, other than like the quest, there has to be humility before the process, a
Yeah.
humility towards the process.
Yeah.
That doesn't always equate that the practitioner will have humility in their life, and humility might not be necessary, and,
Yeah.
and in fact might get in the way sometimes. But there has to be humility towards the process, because you had to really um, respect the material, respect the process,
Mhm.
respect the discipline, but also um, at a certain point, there has to be some type of impulse that and the people telling you no, that's wrong, that they're wrong. I mean, that's
Right.
so where does but that see, I mean, that could there's a time when you do need to listen to people, and there's a time where you had to kind of strike out on your own, no matter what anybody's telling you.
Right. And I think that comes down to balance, right? You said earlier, and I agree wholeheartedly, the idea that society with a capital S, for a variety of reasons, is always trying to drive that impulse away because it doesn't understand it, because it can't be defined and necessarily monetized. I
Right,
think some of the stuff you're talking about, and you certainly talk about it in your writing, and it comes through in your music and especially your live performance. But it's this notion of and I think this applies to writing. I think it applies to any passion is if when younger people ask, what does it take? And it's like, well, you at some point you need to pay the bills and you need to nourish yourself, but the the quest has to be more important than anything else. It has to
right,
be that deeply meaningful to you that you persevere through the beginning stages, the rejection, the isolation, and at a certain point, with all the other things we've mentioned, the two words we haven't mentioned yet, which I think are critical, are spiritual satisfaction and just the ecstasy of being engaged in the act. So you're not thinking about the paycheck or
right,
the applause or the book sales or whatever. You're deriving a certain amount of pleasure that can't be satisfied through anything other than what you're doing.
right. Well, I think that um, gets umbrellaed under the, sometimes that you have to do it. I mean, it's just like it's inside of you
Hmm.
and it has to come out, period.
Hmm.
And so therefore, I mean, then like somebody like Monk, you can look at his playing as just one aspect of the mode of his life because he's a genre of sorts. I mean, his personality is
Yeah.
a genre, and his name even sounds like his playing. Thelonious Spears Monk. It
Right.
kind of sounds like the music,
Yeah.
and he fostered a look. And it's not. This is not fashion. This is
Yep.
a lifestyle, a mode of living that's of a piece of the whole thing. It's a holistic
Yep.
kind of thing. He didn't really have a choice. I mean, I don't. I doubt he could have done anything else.
Right.
Um, he definitely had a support system around him, mainly of women, his mother, his wife, and then his patron, the Baroness.
Yes.
Um, but if it wasn't for that support system and if it wasn't for the music, who knows? He might have just died at a young. I mean, because
Right.
he didn't really have, and there was no thought of an escape route or, you know, it was just that's what he did, and that's how his life moved.
Yep.
Um, yeah, I recall a really beautiful poem you wrote about Charlie Parker and heroin, and I'm trying to remember it. But there. Okay, it's Charlie Parker who is the father of modern jazz,
Yep.
maybe the greatest jazz musician ever. And I say that because there's no hierarchy of. I mean,
Right.
but I mean, how are you going to say Charlie Parker's greater than Duke Ellington? I mean, but Charlie Parker's um, his position within kind of a certain type of language, he's kind of an archetype of a certain thing. He
Right.
died at 34, I think. He was an extremely addictive personality, and he was addicted in all kinds of ways, and ways that, like, usually if you're addicted this way, you're not addicted that way. But he had all of it. So in other words, there's a massive like life spirit in him that unfortunately got caught. But when I look at his output, it's just that like the trajectory is like I don't see any other trajectory it could have had.
Right.
It was that it could have been without the addictions, maybe
Right.
it could have been but there was just such a concentration, not only in music, not only in jazz, but in a very specific way that
Yeah.
funneled into a very specific product, if you want to call it that, and then in a very specific mode of how the product unfolded, both how we perceive history, how it commercially unfolded
Right.
until his death, and then that's the parentheses, and then he becomes an icon in a different way in American culture or world culture.
Yeah.
That's not really answering your question.
Sure it is.
But what's the poem of yours I'm remembering? Sort of
Oh, you're talking
remembering.
about something I wrote. well, I talk about, Bach having a deep faith, and it must have been helpful for him to think that he was just channeling what God
Oh,
wanted to do. Where Parker,
exactly.
was living without a net and
Right, right, right.
benefit from it.
Right, right.
But
And
he
and
suffered.
they could have been they could have been channeling similar kind of things because both of them are very in one way logical, mathematical.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, even though there's a mystery. I mean, they're great artists. I'm not saying that they're reducible to formula, but they both really balance the irrational and the irrational in an extreme way. And yeah, so you were talking about the social safety nets that Bach had. That so I was a brilliant poem, by the way.
Wow.
Uh, um, but and it got me thinking because when I read it, it crystallized a lot of things that I've actually been thinking of that I didn't think of exactly in that structure the way you put it there.
Mm.
But yeah, that was very interesting. I don't remember the question.
Well, let me do this, because I think this takes us, this can circle back toward the path and the balance. But I will hold you up, again, from knowing you, knowing about you, following your career. I don't want to put you in any kind of box, but I want to elevate what I think is fascinating, especially with Charlie Parker as a point of departure, is America is so unbelievable that we don't pay enough attention to some of these geniuses, but we take away all the wrong lessons. Like, oh, so jazz musicians were, you had to be on heroin and you had to be unhealthy, and that's what made the music, that pain.
Right,
Get past that's been duly, deconstructed and ridiculed. But I'll hold up you just as an example of someone I see that has made certain choices in terms of your physical well-being, your health, your balance of not just the discipline of the music, but we need to take care of ourselves and our communities in order to remain productive and alive. So again, I
right,
don't want to put you in a box of saying you figured it all out, but like you haven't just been blessed with an ability and good things happen. Like, you've set about to cultivate a life so that the music can happen. You can, sleep and eat and have your life. But
right.
this is all part of the work.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, I talk about in the book. I was an alcoholic, and I stopped drinking at 29. And the person, I mean, I was really blessed. Two people that really lectured to me about my drinking are great black artists. Ted Jones, the beat poet, who is one actual, kind of major surrealist. Um, he lectured. He talked to a friend of mine and told them to talk to me that no matter what talents and abilities I had, if I didn't stop drinking, it would be to
Yeah.
nil. And the great sculptor David Hammonds, who's one of the world's foremost sculptors, was a very close friend of mine. And he walked into a bar one night where I was, looked at me and said, "You look like a fucking alcoholic." And that was the night I actually stopped. I decided that I was, and, plus if I kept drinking the way I was, I would be dead.
Mhm.
My big problem with that was when I started getting a lot of press. I live in the Lower East Side, New York. A bunch of bars around here wanted me hanging out in them, and I was on the bar tab with about four bars around here where I could drink free, and I had had a drinking problem before that, but that truly exasperated the problem. But anyway,
Well,
um,
no, and you listen, that this is great because you talk so movingly. Like, I mean, we're of a similar age. I've never lived in New York, but like, I was alive when New York was the old, dirty, beautiful, dangerous New York. But you write so movingly about this particular moment in time in the 80s. We had
right,
AIDS becoming more not only serious, but there was an awareness, but
right,
all of this, diverse music and art and culture was happening in the underground. And you were right in the middle of that, dancing, playing music, partying. Talk
right.
a little bit about how that was a formative event for you.
Right. Well, first of all, my music. I mean, that's a kind of a social, nexus matrix that my music is my music, and I've been working on that since I was a little kid. But I moved to New York when I was actually 23. The biography is 24, but it was at the end of the year I turned 20. for um actually I moved to New York at the end of 20 my 23rd year. So I was in New York a couple months and I turned 24. So you can say either one. Um it was 1983 and I moved to the Lower East Side and I got very caught into the kind of the social kind of network here. Mainly I moved here, and there was a diverse amount of stuff going on in the Lower East Side in the '80s. If you go to St. Mark's Place, you know you have all the punks walking around with the big spiked hair, and CB's was on the Bowery, and then there's a whole diverse group of dance clubs. And I started going to one called the Pyramid, which I went every night. And you know, if you're not from New York, there was a bunch of clubs, Danceteria, Pyramid, The World, Paradise Garage, the Mud Club. I moved to New York right after the Mud Club closed, so I missed that. But the other clubs is a very similar kind of social um, kind of way of mode of being that goes through all of that kind of nightlife. So I was, you know, that was my social life as a young adult. I mean, and like Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, they used to hang out in all those clubs,
Yeah.
and that was kind of my social world. And but also in the neighborhood there was a black art scene, kind of centered around a poet named Steve Cannon, who used to have a gallery called Gathering of the Tribes. But all kinds of people came to that, and then there was a Latino poetry scene that's known. The New Rican Poets Cafe is the kind of famous institution that got founded from that scene. But all these scenes interacted too. I mean, you know, you have the dance scene and the art scene around Basquiat. That a lot of that occurred in the dance clubs. But even with that being separate from CBGB's, which was a punk club, there's a punk sensibility that kind of filtered into the dance clubs. And then, you know, I talked about the black art scene, the Latino, you know, that all kind of intersects with all of it within the dance club, the galleries. Um, and then on top of that, there was this jazz scene, an underground jazz scene here. Everybody had lived in this neighborhood. In fact, Charlie Parker lived on 10th Street and Avenue B, and I was homeless for a little while when I moved here. And the woman that lived in that house let me move in. So I lived in Charlie Parker's house for 3 months. Um, but there's all of that in the Lower East Side intersected in a seamless unity. Um, Also, you know, as far as gender issues, a lot of these clubs had a very strong gay element to them. And you know, in fact, at the Pyramid where I hung out, you know, that was a lot of drag was happening there. RuPaul was doing his shows, and all of this is together seamlessly. And you know, it was a smorgasbord of ways of being, but all connected and interacting. And it was a really volcano of creative activity happening. And you know, even in the rock aspect of it, you know, Blondie, I mean, say Clem, the drummer, just died a
Yeah.
couple of days ago from us doing this. Um, you know, she was around. I mean, a lot of people were around. So I moved right into a really vibrant scene. And for me, yeah, I was a young adult. I was kind of maybe a little socially awkward before I moved here, but moving here, it was for me. It's like wow, yeah, it was just
Right.
kind of like perfect from my time that time in my life, and I ate it up. I mean, and I you know it was a very decadent scene too, and I you know you're in your young 20s,
Right.
that can be good even in the midst of the AIDS crisis. Um, that didn't stop the decadence.
Sure.
Was gone in full force actually. But I mean, you know, a lot of people, and as far as self-destructive aspects, like in this scene, heroin. Oh, I mean, there were a lot of. It was the '80s. There was a lot of crack in New York, but heroin was a really big thing, both in the jazz scene and with older black jazz musicians, which I was hanging out with a lot of older jazz musicians who were heroin addicts, and I talk about that in the book, how they were so supportive of me and really looking out for me not to get involved with choices they had made in their life. And the heroin was really rampant in the club scenes with the younger people I was hanging out too. But you know, even though I was drinking really heavily, I had no interest in narcotics. And despite the fact that like one of my favorite writers was William Burroughs, not so much from the writing aspect, but for the ideas,
Yeah.
because he's a vortex of ideas. Whether he's is the best person to structure them, that's a whole different question.
Right.
But he's a cultural icon, um and his writing is unimaginable without the heroin and the morphine. It wouldn't have existed. But I mean, or it's a big component of it. I'll say it that way. That might be a better way of putting it. But yeah, I knew that it would take a long time for me to get. My father used to say, tell me with your ideas is you're basically not going to really be accepted until like right, like when you're like right before you. It's gonna. He used to say it's going to take a whole lifetime for people to get you. And there from the very beginning, there were people that understood what I was doing, trying to do. But for any time, and I still had, you in the introduction, you talked about kind of a universal acceptance of me. I have a lot of critical acclaim, but there's a lot of people that still, you know, are waiting for me to be dead before they say they finally get it. And that's not ego. That's reality. I mean, there's a lot of people that are comfortable saying he might have something, but we'll wait and give it time. So I always knew that I would had to take care of myself and hope for some type of longevity, and to be able to really keep doing what I'm doing and to have a lifestyle at least where I can pay my bills. I stopped working a day job in 1989, so and I was making a living in music. It was a lot of very, very hairy years. And I mean, very hairy, but I was able to do it. And, but, I did realize that I would have to take care of myself to be able, because it's easy to like go down the route of being either drug addict, alcoholic, a sex addict, and then all of that and then just being really bitter that the world hasn't recognized you and then all of that having an effect on your health and all that. Yeah, I've seen that happen in a lot of instances, and I do not want to be that person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's easier to be distracted if you allow yourself to be distracted, but also, I think speaking personally, but I think you and I have some solidarity here, and many serious artists try to cultivate. It's all about creating a life that feeds the life. So everything you,
Right,
whether it's reading books, practicing, performing, sleeping, thinking, praying, meditating, all of these things are in and of themselves, hopefully productive or enjoyable in some way, but it's all about constructing an environment that is, conducive to peace and productivity. And you know, you clearly, and gosh, I'd love you to elaborate on this, but I mean, because I don't want to throw this word around because it could almost sound like damning with faint praise, but I mean, you have been very prolific, and I emphasize that to point out how in awe I am, but also that doesn't just happen. To be prolific and have to put out a lot of work, there's such a discipline and but also something the channeling is happening. Like it's
right, right,
the pump is being primed constantly. And I don't think that's luck. I think that is
right.
one has engineered conditions to allow that to happen.
Well, no, that's exactly right. And on one level, it's a natural part of the organism because everybody goes to sleep at night, and everybody, if you could wake up and record your dreams, you would see that you're prolific.
Right.
And probably the structure of them throughout your life is different, and there's different content to them. So that what I'm saying that is the subconscious process is infinite in and of itself, and prolific for that reason. So it's a matter of trying to, whatever medium you work in, trying to hook that to that that gush of subconscious forces that you have that are infinite. Um, so that's the challenge. So that means you're trying to make it in one level a very naturalistic thing. It's not about it should be on one level as easy as breathing, or but yeah, everybody goes to sleep at night, and everybody, if you recorded your dreams, you would see that you're a master. Everybody is a master storyteller in that regard. So it's a matter of getting the medium that you work with your conscious mind, um, to hook up to that stream of subconscious forces that is infinite.
I love that, Matt. And again, we'll talk more. But folks, if you're listening now, again, he gets into this in more detail in the book. But you made me just think right now. In of course, our we both love Charles Mingus. Who doesn't love Charles Mingus? But in his autobiography, Beneath the Underdog, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but I wrote this in a journal like back in the '90s because it meant so much to me. But he's talking about when he realized like he was still hustling day jobs, and he says something along the lines of, I'm always composing. I'm
Right.
delivering mail, I'm eating, I'm asleep, I'm walking the dog, I'm composing." And he fundamentally understands, he's been doing it so long, it starts to get at what we talk about when we talk about mastery or putting in the hours. But he noted like a specific shift. And I don't in any way, form, or fashion compare myself, but I certainly went through that as a writer, where you do it long enough, you think about it, you respect it. It's not that it becomes easier so much as you're understanding how to respect the possibility of being able to channel things when they come. And basically, again, respecting and making it more important so that you're not distracted or hungover or at a party when a moment of inspiration might come.
Right. Well, I can speak from the past that, the moment of inspiration can come when you're hungover, and you can translate it, but
Right, right.
that is in the realm of the possible. But but it's
It's
not
hard to
fun.
sustain that.
Right, but it's not fun doing that with headaches.
Right.
Um, I never read Beneath the Underdog. I started it once, and when I was like young, and I, for some reason, you get caught up in other stuff. I put it down and never got back to it. Um, yeah, Charles Mingus. Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. um, yeah, well, the process is eternal.
Yeah.
And again, your subconscious mind is always working out the solution to a problem, to all problems. Always. I mean, you could be taking a bath,
Yeah.
eating. It is always working on the solution to the problem. If you want to call coming up with a artistic product the solution, I mean, because I don't know if you're working on a problem. I don't know. I don't know if the terminology applies.
Sure.
But it's actually in one of the poems in the book, because there's prose poems, essays, and some poems. I talk about the art of improvisation as something that you don't even need the act for it to actualize itself, and it's a process that's occurring eternally, on a subconscious level anyway. So if you put out a poem, if you put out a composition, a piece of music, or if you actually, you in real time do a improvisation on an instrument, what are the parentheses? Um, I think in the Carlos Castaneda books, he talks about the parentheses around eternity. So if something kind of goes into space time, and say it exists in a field outside of space time as a probability, well, I mean, what are those? What are the parentheses in that? Is the product, even if it's a master, what society calls a masterpiece, is it any better than if it exists in a platonic pure form that might have perfection, whatever that means. I don't know what perfection means, but I don't know. I'm asking a question. So, I think Mingus is talking about being attuned to a process that's always going on, but you're so caught up, it becomes a mode of life. It becomes the mode of life, not a mode of life. So if you're always looking for source material, so just watching somebody walk down the street, you're learning about rhythm. Because I mean, it's all language. If you're a funk musician and you're living, say, in the Black community, the way people talk, the way people walk, that's feeding into the music. That's a part of the language. And so everything is going into the hopper of the subconscious, and everything is being translated as language, as material. And
Right.
I think he's talking about becoming hyper focused in that mode of existence. And therefore, at that point, even if you're not at your instrument, if you're listening to a washing machine, you're learning something about music, and it's being translated to some type of symbol in your subconscious mind that eventually comes out in the music. So at that point, everything is entering into the hopper. Everything is entering into the vortex of whatever, um, wherever it enters deep into your system and comes out in another way. It's food. It's food for thought. It's food for creativity. Everything, including your boss screaming at you. At your
Yeah.
job that you might hate.
Yeah. Yeah.
That becomes part of the motivational structure, and actually even part of the music. I mean, part of it means something to you. It's a symbol of some aspect of human existence, and it gets melted down, and it enters, and it gets regurgitated as some aspect of your language.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great scene in the movie Mozart, Amadeus, I mean, where his mother-in-law is screaming at him, and he starts to write, the aria of the opera. I think that gets at what
Oh God, I never saw it.
it it
I
it 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 attempts to do, the impossible. Like, well, where does it come
right,
from? And but I think that leads me to another question, which again, I think I'd be selling you short if I didn't kind of underscore. I don't think it's a coincidence that this productivity, this wide range of styles, the different people you've played with, it seems safe to me, both from the book and knowing you, you've got a lot of passions and a lot of being curious, having, deep curiosity and interest in the world and people, history. That all feeds a healthy, creative mind. You love boxing.
right,
write brilliantly and with deep knowledge about the history of boxing. You've talked obviously about you were really into dancing. I do think there is something that connects creative, that they're in love with all aspects of life, and it's like you insatiable appetite. And I think the real trick is when you're able to channel that into an original voice, some powerful things can occur.
right. A couple of things with that. Everything's a language. Even a panhandler asking for a quarter. That's a language. There's something
Sure.
going on there. There's something that if you believe in the Big Bang, whatever cosmology, that person and the possibility of that interaction comes out of the same Big Bang that like a Beethoven string quartet comes out. So there's something to understand in that transaction. So yes, I mean I'm kind of interested in every possible. First, I'm interested in why any of this exists. Like it all doesn't make sense. None of it, and I say that like none of it makes sense
Right.
to me. Yeah, it does. I mean, I guess like if you take the myth of the Garden of Eden, like if you're thrust into this garden and it's just you and somebody else, and you guys are naked and all you do is eat fruit and have sex. I mean, I don't know what else. I mean, that kind of makes sense to me. Yeah, because I guess it was they were living on pure instinct also because they didn't even realize they were naked until like she bit the apple. Um, but so I guess not even realizing you're naked and there's a choice between supposed good and evil. Um, Whatever that means, because there was a tree of good and evil and a tree of knowledge. So there was one tree of a kind of a synthesis, and then the one tree of a separation between light that goes, in different spectrums. Um, but okay, so I guess what I'm saying is, if it's one thing if you're living on pure instinct and you're not evaluating all the possibilities, and because then it's just pure being. It is what it is, period. And there's not, I mean, there shouldn't even be a language for that. Like when you can say it is what it is, that's a language. But pure instinct, I don't even see how there could be a language about it. But I mean, once choices are made and you start, there's different societies that are ruled by whole different perceptions of reality. And then you kind of realize that the possibilities are infinite. So why do we decide this and this and this? And then why are their whole histories based on this? Emerson has a great line, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, the philosopher, that like we can think we know everything about history, but yet we know nothing about the history of like the mice that are in your house. They have a whole annal of history, and I'm not talking about from our system of taxonomy or understanding. I mean, from in their world, they're like we have no concept of what their history based on what their central nervous system. So, in other words, like none of us know anything basically. I mean, there's millions of bits of information out here in the cosmos. We're probably have the with our brain structure, we can probably understand one or two bits of information out of zillions quadrillions out here. So that's all to say, none of us understand anything and nothing. Not even what we think we understand, we actually don't understand.
Right.
So, um, all that's to say that I'm kind of interested in, like, if somebody walks by me in the street and they say hi and we smile, why they, or if they give me the middle finger and say fuck you, like, why? I mean, like, and all of that feeds my art. It's just a basic understanding of like, why do, and I talk about this in the lecture at the end of the book. Why do I even play this thing? First of all, I don't even understand who I am. I exist. Like my parents called me Matthew Shipp, but that's not who I am. What my the name I get, I'm some stream of energy out here. And then, I, I started playing piano as a young kid, and people encouraged me to continue because I seemed to have this thing that they call talent. And I decided to do it for a living. Like why? Because people told me I was good at it, and I conceived I would get money. And then at a younger age, I was looking for somebody to have sex with, and I figured like girls seemed to think I was cool because I could play this thing, and if I play it, I could probably get a lot of sex. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
just, there's like
Yeah.
the things that go into motivation, and like I'm a big boxing fan. Why the hell would anybody want to get hit in the head to
Yeah.
make a living? Well, you end up in a gym when you're young. Well, first of all, with a lot of people, it's a way to stay off the street. There's a boxing gym in their community. They probably get in fights on the street, and they probably have some degree like intelligence that makes them channel it into and then they realize I'm good at this, so I could probably might be able to make money. It might be like working in some other job, and then there'll be social status by doing it in my community, and um, I'll get on TV. I'll get
Yeah.
a lot. I'll get a lot of girls. Whatever. There's a lot of things that go. I mean, Duke Ellington is notorious. Like the reason he noticed when he started playing at parties, there was a girl sitting here and a girl sitting here, and that was what. But and then at a later date, like the art takes over.
Yeah.
You it actually is about the music and what you have inside of you to do. you're not looking for a million girls. Yeah, I mean, whatever. Like
Yeah.
it becomes, but all that's to say that none of us understand any of this. Um, and there's a lot of information out here.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about, I'm curious about motivation, why we do this, and why does the cosmos relegate these areas of activity for people to do, and why does somebody decide to do it? As a avant-garde jazz musician, which somebody thinks, there's supposedly is a complex things, or I don't really think what I do has any more intrinsic value than you know a, a rock musician or any or a folk singer. Yeah, in fact, I do it because I understand it and I'm good at it, and that seemed to be my life's that's what I was drawn to, and that seems to be my life's purpose. But
Right.
I don't think there's any more intrinsic value to what I do than what a lot of other people do in idioms, where people might try to prop me up that you do this thing that's complex or difficult to understand. Um, that's not why I do it. But to answer your question, I am any. There's a reason I'm trying to get at people's motivations to do things. Like even if I don't understand it or get it or like it,
Right.
I do. I mean, I'm not saying I do exercise value judgments, and there's things I hate, and
Right.
there's things that I actually think are regressive.
Yes.
But at the same time, I'm trying to understand people, the motivation for how things come about and why, and the energy behind it. I'm interested in that. So that makes me have a lot of different things I'm interested in. And I do see all those things feeding into my understanding of motivation. Now, I talk about motivation in the book in reference to boxing and jazz, the connection and like why somebody would do either of these things. If my wife and I, we don't have kids. But if I had a kid and they told me they wanted to be a jazz musician or a boxer, I would go back to being an alcoholic. Um, you know, I don't understand why anybody would want to do either of those, but I actually made a choice for one of them. And
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think this the structure of the psyche and the structure of the energy that makes you get out of bed in the morning to do anything
Yes.
is what interests me, and I try to structure that within the realm of being a so-called like modern jazz musician, and but I'm trying to get at something universal that has nothing to do with idioms that would make anybody sit back and say, like, why am I alive? Even why? I mean, is it a random bumping together of chemicals in a mechanical universe, which I don't believe it is personally. Um, but because to me that would be more of a miracle if all the complexity and all the not only the complexity of everything that exists, and the complexity I don't mean just on planet Earth, but
Right.
like in the zillions of other planets that exist. The
Sure.
complex if all of that was just random chemicals, and then when you get into the complexity of the fact that we actually have emotions like love and caring, and if that could be reduced to a chemical formula, the fact that people are willing to die for a cause and they're really willing to die so future, Martin Luther King probably knew he would be killed, but he was willing to die for a cause to for future generations to be able to have something to build on, and people are willing, you know, to die for their families or whatever, and for the bigger cause. I personally have a hard time believing that random chemicals make all of that, because if it's all about survival of the fittest, I think in other books Darwin also talked about something that he loosely called love, also that was a determinant factor. I haven't really I haven't read Zorn, so I'm talking about what I gleaned through reading other writers that talk about the other side of him, apart from
Mhm.
um, and I could be talking out of my ass and completely wrong about this, but I'm just saying that I don't know if I believe in purpose in the universe. I believe purpose exists, but I don't know how purpose could be a part of eternity. Let's put it that way, because to me, infinity and eternity imply every possibility realizing itself in some system, some dimension, some energies paradigm at some point in so and even paradigms that are outside of space time. So I don't know what purpose means there, but purpose exists within the subset of all that. So um all of that is to say, since infinity is flying through all of us and we can never understand it,
Yeah,
um at least we have the subset of who we are. And you might as well just say, fuck all you. This is who I am. This is where I'm at. And I'm going to say who I am and where I'm at, because what else is there? I mean, you can acquiesce to the accepted paradigms that exist, but if stuff is flowing through you, that's your that's you, why it's flowing through you, to get it out.
that's right. And I think it ultimately comes down to making a choice, right? We can respond to
Right.
existential angst, fear, survival of the fittest, etc., in any number of violent or nonsensical or just becoming paralyzed. I think there are those of us that take on the burden of trying to turn that into beauty, which in
Right.
my not so humble opinion is what you've made a career doing. Um, I want to ask you, and this is a very it's selfish in the literal sense because it might only matter to me, but I think your answer is going to be very insightful for others. I think I've talked to you about how deeply, I mean, if I could have spent the whole hour talking about your specific work and what I love, but one of your compatriots, David S. Ware, an album from 2003 called Threads, which in addition to being a masterpiece, I would just love you to respond to me saying the composition Carousel of Lightness that's on that that is one of my touchstones, and in
Right.
that it does the feelings that conjures. I have access to places that make me think of both the Coltrane's, John and Alice, and Mozart. It's somehow it's a feeling that is a language that is music, but it's that other which writers ultimately
Right.
get pigeonholed and have to just use words like it's other.
Right.
Any thoughts about that particular piece, the recording, what the circumstances were like, or my feelings about your playing there?
Well, first of all, well, for anybody that's watching this that doesn't know, David S. Ware is a tenor sax player that I played with for 16 years. I was in his quartet. Um, he was a protege of Sonny Rollins, and he had played with Cecil Taylor and Andrew Cyrille, and then he started his own quartet. I was in it. On that, I played piano with him, but on that album, he had me playing a Korg synthesizer, and we also had a violist and a violinist on it. And it was so I was playing string sounds on the synthesizer, so it's a lot different. After you told me about that your feelings on that album, I actually went back and read the review on allmusic.com, and Tom
Yeah.
Dirac, who reviewed that album there, has very similar feelings to you about that album. Um, what it represented for him in the context of Ware's recorded work and in general. And somebody else wrote me a line once and said that album changed their life. Somebody I know wrote me. And that person wrote me an email like about 3 or 4 years ago. So I went back and listened to it because I hadn't listened to it since like 2005 or something. And
Wow,
it really is a very intense experience. I don't really remember much from recording. I'm on 200, maybe 300 some albums. So, but I do remember it was my idea for him to do that album. And I said, David, you should do an album where your playing is not emphasized, but some compositions, and it's with a string group.
Yep.
And he said, I have a synthesizer, so why don't you play the string sounds? Like, cool. And then he, we decided to add. I think Matt Maneri and Daniel Bernard Romain are on those albums. If
Yeah.
I'm not, if I remember correct, Matt Maneri is a violist that plays with me a lot. And
Yeah.
if Daniel Bernard Romain is on it, if he is, which I think he is, I think he was the music director with Philip Glass's group.
Okay.
He's a black composer who's a violinist, and he was like in Philip Glass's ensemble. And he was a friend of mine. I had played with him. Well, not we're not close friends or anything, but I had played with him in a project with DJ Spooky, so I knew him from there. Um, yeah, no, it was really David writes really arresting, beautiful themes. So I knew he had some material, but to have it in emphasis with the compositions with the string group, and where it's not about David as virtuoso jazz saxophonist, it's about the overall kind of affected world, not affected, but effect of the world between his compositional brilliance um, and his basic melodic sensibility transferred to strings, you know, together with some playing of his, but not, it's not about being in the jazz setting where that's the center. It made for a striking CD. Yeah, I agree.
So thank you for that. And I love, I appreciate the genuine humility of like been on a lot of sessions, I don't particularly remember, but for people, I'm positive people checking this out are intrigued. I'm very positive. We want to remind you again, new book out, folks, to really get a handle on what we're talking about. But if you were to say, and this is, I love this, Matt, because I'm putting you in a corner. It's a dumb, impossible question, but for a newcomer, what would you recommend someone that wants to discover your work? Is there a particular album or
Wow.
period that you would say start here or don't start here or anything?
No, I would. I mean, I would. I think on one level, my last trio album, New Concepts in Piano Trio Jazz, is really kind of the coming together of me in every way. So I think that's a really good one
Yep.
to start out with. Even though that's a really hard question. I can't answer that. I mean, because everybody's different and
Yep.
everybody might have different entry points that work for them.
Yep.
I mean, I know you like Equilibrium a lot, which is an album back in my Beats days when I was doing projects with electric beats and stuff. I mean, I'm playing piano on the album, but I have a programmer that had worked with some hip hop people, and
Yeah.
it's kind of a my. I mean, and but that's true to who I am as a jazz
Totally.
musician too. And
Totally.
that I mean, I know a lot of people that was their entry point to me.
Right.
That album. But it's a hard question to answer. There's another album I did with Wadada Leo Smith, a trumpet player, called New Orbit, that is kind of an ambient jazz suite, and that might work for some people. And then there's an album called Pastoral Composure with Roy Campbell, the late Roy Campbell, really great trumpet player. Um, that might work for some people. And then there's a solo album I did, Zero, which I think on ESP record label, which I think really brings together a lot for me. I mean, right off the top of my head, those are some of the albums I would name, but I don't. That's an impossible question to answer.
Good. I like impossible. I like that. No, those are none of those answers surprise me. I guess I'll just also, since I have you here, a shout out both to David S. Ware, William Parker, Live in the World, David S. Ware Quartet, to
But
me is one of the high watermarks of music the last.
no, I love that's the one with the three CDs. Is it
Yeah.
three? Right. There's three live performances we did, and all with different drummers too.
Yes.
Um, I was in the David S. Ware Quartet for 16 years, and the great bassist William Parker, who was a mentor to me. In some ways, he was in that quartet also, and yeah, I really that live set, those three live concerts. really meant a lot to me. There's one with Susie Ibarra, right? One with
Yes,
Hamid Drake and one with Guillermo E. Brown on
that's
drums,
right. That's it.
right? Um, that label that put that out, Thirsty Year, I was actually working for the label as a curator and an A&R person. So obviously I brought David in since I was in the band also.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Uh, but and I think Threads is on that label also, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that's
mean, like Thirsty, the turn of the century, which was when I was really beginning to get into you, that was a particularly interesting kind of moment in time, right? Where we were the beats and the sampling, it was like trip hop had happened, jazz
right.
obviously was still happening, but it was almost it would seem to me a reflection of the times, but also kind of a not so subtle pushback to the get back to the classic, from the Scorsese documentary that completely overlooked, the underground and the avant-garde. I felt that was a very
Uh,
critical
right.
transition.
You mean the
Ken
Ken
Burns, I'm sorry,
right,
Martin Scorsese, I think did blues. Yeah, the Ken
right,
Burns, shame on me.
right,
Yes.
right. Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that because the way I got into the idea of kind of doing some projects with beats. Well, first of all, back even when I was a club kid going to the pyramid, I remember one night walking out, um, drunk out of my gourd. But I just remember having this kind of mystical experience of hearing what I do kind of over Rum DMC. Uh, but that was just like a fleeting, like kind of image that came. And at the time, I mean, obviously Herbie Hancock had done projects
Right.
in the 70s of that sort. And even in the 80s when I was a club kid, Rocket was a big hit.
Yes. Sure.
Um, but that all went out of my head. And then my wife was a big trip hop fan, and now we're going into the 90s.
Hmm.
Uh, my wife was a big trip hop fan, and she really loved back in the day Massive Attack and Trippy. And she used to jokingly say to me, you should probably. I could hear some of it, like, you doing stuff over this, and I was thinking, yeah, right, and it never. But then, like, there was a band, Spring Hill Jack, that was a trip hop band, and they got in touch with my record label and wanted to do a jazz project, and they actually had produced, or one of the members of the band had produced work. They were friends with the Massive Attack people, and John Coxon, I think, had produced Anything But the Girl, or had something to do with it, and which was like the music my wife listened to, and it was just kind of really weird that they actually contacted me to do something.
Yeah,
So Spring Hill, so then I got me thinking that maybe it's not that crazy to do
right.
something. And then I met DJ Spooky at a party, and he saw me there, and we started talking, and he knew my work, and he said, "Yeah, we should do a project together." And I was really, I mean, it's like okay, like there
Yeah.
was a lot at the same, and then I got contacted by Anti Pop Consortium, a hip hop band that wanted to work with me, and it was just like all at the same time, and it was like, okay, that the world, the cosmos is trying to get a message across to me, yeah.
Totally.
So
Totally. Yeah, and by the way, shout out to Optometry, your joint with DJ
DJ
Spooky, another one
Spooky,
of my personal all-time favorites.
yeah, that album is a very iconic album, and I was, yeah, I've been talking to Spooky recently. I mean, not about doing anything new, but he's been interested in the book, talking about the book, so. Uh,
Good.
but yeah, that was a very interesting period, and I'm really glad I went did it. I think some good work came out of it, and it got to the point where I wanted to go back to my quote pure um, existence as a jazz musician. Um, I looked at, the stuff I was doing was me. It was almost like just orchestration. Like if you're a composer, you have a piece with the cello, you have a piece with the trumpet, and that was I was orchestrating using beats.
Yeah.
So it was a very interesting and fertile period.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you've managed to, I've seen you over the years. You keep threatening to stop making albums, but they keep coming. So I certainly hope in
Right.
whatever capacity you are channeling this. I'm gonna assume you can't turn it off because we can't turn off our minds, especially if we're actively receiving. But you've already given us so much, but I certainly am here for it if there's more
Well,
writing.
there'll be a little more. I do think. that, you know, I don't want to be 70 and 80 and still trying to be relevant. I want to give it over. I'm six as we speak now. How old am I? What year? Oh, I'm 64 now. I'll be 65 this year. I want to give it over to a new generation. I mean, kind of the model for me is Alice Coltrane because she went up in the mountains, had her ashram.
Yeah,
She occasionally came out to do concerts, but it was not like she was trying to be in the middle of it all after a certain point. And in jazz or in the music business, you always feel like you never got your due, so you're still trying to get your due, and you're still trying to,
sure.
and then you start kind of really getting your due, maybe not to the degree you think you should, but
Right.
you're still always trying to get that deficit done, and you're trying to
Yeah.
make your point, but yet you might actually be taking up a lot of oxygen at that point, and sucking it from younger people that might, and I
Yeah.
don't want to be that person at 70
Yeah.
and still trying to. So I kind of do want to slightly disappear, um, but that doesn't mean you stop playing.
Sure.
And that also, yeah, you can't really turn it off. But there is that point of silence I'm looking for, and I don't know if that means even if the language is flowing through you, that you just enter into it in an internal way, and the idea of having to have other people partake of it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the years ahead of me have to offer. Um, I can only guess at the possibilities, and I could see um, going silent. I could see it, and that's a statement in and of itself. There's a language to the silence, and I could see that. I could definitely see it. I mean, obviously, to do that, you need a support system that allows you to do that. And most Black composers slash improvisers, maybe slash jazz musicians, don't have that infrastructure in place like a lot of non-Black musicians might
Sure.
socially. So a lot of choices do get made, or actually, massively, a lot of choices get made by the economic environment that you're thrust in the middle of. So you can. There's an article in 1999 in New York Magazine. Mark Jacobson did an article. A really great journalist. He's a novelist also. Did an article called Matt Shipp's Out in 1999 in New York Magazine, and I was. The reason the article got because I was saying in 1999 I was retired from recording and never going to record again. But that's like what 180 albums ago. And I say in the article, I don't want to keep my tempo is complete, and I don't see the need for embellishment for the sake of the cash advance. Yeah. But the sake of the cash advance is a very loud language in and of itself. That can have a lot of sway in
Sure.
decisions.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes into all this.
Oh yeah. Well, I think it's safe to say, the music finds you, and then people find the music, and
Right,
somewhere in that algebra, that's where the connection and the magic happens.
right,
You've already done so much. You continue to give more. So I, I could talk to you all day. I think what I'll do as a closing salvo is say, let's talk more. We can see how your book interacts with the world, and we'll touch base and continue the conversation. We can even go much deeper into some of
right.
the philosophical implications. But um,
Right. Well, I mean, can I say one thing about? I
or
think for the book, there's a lot of there's tributes to certain jazz musicians that I really meant a lot to me. There's since this collection of stuff I've written over the years, there's obituaries I've written for. Um, I mean, especially there's David Ware, who I played with for 16 years. I did 3 obituaries for him for different publications, and 2 of them are in there. There's pieces on jazz stuff, and then there's pieces on nothing to do with jazz at all, and then there's kind of metaphysical prose poems about the act of creativity and what what that means to me. And even though there's some very jazz centric pieces in there, you don't have to know a lot about jazz to get something out of the book. I mean, I just want to emphasize that. Don't even the Black Mystery School essay, which is about jazz and certain classifications and a certain sub school of pianists within that, and it gets into that, but there's things to be gleaned from the essay if you don't understand the names, and then there's other essays in the book where that are not about jazz per se at all. So I don't want to be, if somebody's not into jazz, and if you're interested in the book
Yep.
for any reason, don't let the fact that you're not a jazz head scare you from reading it.
Well said. Here, here. I would say, Matt Shipp is a musician, an improviser, a composer, a pianist, a writer, but you are an ambassador for culture. You channel it, you talk about it, you have a passion for it, but you also try to infuse others with that passion. I think that's one of the big takeaways. I'm a much smarter, more curious person having read your book, just like your
Oh, thank
music,
you.
continues to inspire me in ways, you probably can never imagine. So,
Right. Thank you very
unconditional
much.
debts of gratitude.
Right. And I want to thank All in the Media for publishing the book. A great publisher. They're mainly known for kind of anarchist texts. Um, they've done in they I live in the Lower East Side, New York. They've done a lot of things with Lower East Side writers and culture. And they also, for a period, were connected with Semiotex, the French publisher of post-structuralist work, philosophers and stuff. So I'm really, I feel it was a perfect place for the book, for a perfect publisher for this book.
Absolutely. All right. Well, folks, Black Mystery School Pianists and Other Writings, capitalized writings. Matt, amazing to have you here. I really appreciate you taking the time. And again, I mean,
Thank you. And thank you as a poet for writing about Albert Ayler and Coltrane and
you.
Bird and us people that are breathing and still live that need, that are still on the planet. Thank you. And writing about it not in a way that's, about jazz, but going deeper and finding, some things in their psyche or in their connection to society that need to be said. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I was going to fastidiously avoid any mention of my own work, but I will say, you provided incredibly generous, and your blurb for my first collection was way more interesting than any of the poems. But
Oh, come on.
um,
That's not true. That's
having
not
having
true.
you having you validate some of the stuff
Right.
I said, coming from someone I deeply admire and am in awe of, it was incredibly generous. It was very sustained me, and is very inspiring. So I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you very much.
All right, Matt, we'll talk to you again soon, folks. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Again, this is the podcast where we're obsessed with creativity and story. If you've got a story to tell, check me out at seanmurphy.net. Let me know if you want to be on. In the meantime, support our artists, be kind, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.